Well, while this is being set up, let me just take this opportunity to congratulate Lynn or Chris Edwards, I don't think and Sally, Richard, and all for putting this amazing program for the last 15 years that have really transformed, as we talked about yesterday, what's going on at Stanford and beyond, and all the industrial partners, and that has truly been transformative beyond Stanford, not just Stanford. So what I'm going to talk about is what we have started doing in a group which is dramatically different from what we used to do when I was, for the last 25 years, especially most of it at Berkeley. And this is a collaboration with Will Chu, who you heard from in the morning, as well as Mike Toney, and these are the students. Hyung-Yu was a postdoc in our group, Shang Zai, Jimmy Rojas, Nadi Alborg, and then Kipil Lim. And this is to look at hydrogen production. So before I move forward, let me just give you quickly how hydrogen is produced today. Most of the hydrogen is produced by steam methane reforming. I won't go into the details of that, but this is a $100 billion industry, mostly used for ammonia, as well as refinery, and some for methanol, and some cryogenics. And so there are, of course, carbon emissions from this process, but the cost of hydrogen production today is on the order of about $1.50 or $2 a kilogram. So this is an existing industry, and the question is, can we decarbonize? But hydrogen has other implications as well. If you could somehow produce carbon-free hydrogen, it has implications of what you do with CO2. So it turns out to be extremely important commodity. But the key is to produce it at, hopefully less than $2 a kilogram. And if most of the cost is really in the energy, and if you do the math, it turns out that the cost of energy has to be less than $30 a megawatt hour, where today, as you heard from before, wind is sort of getting there. It's already there in some places. Solar is getting there, et cetera. And if you look at the pathways to get there, you have electrochemical pathways, photochemical, biochemical, as you heard of earlier, and thermochemical. A lot of work is going on in electrochemical because you get such cheap electricity today. What I'm going to talk about is a different approach, and in terms of research, so we are trying to create options out here, and one of the options is thermochemical. And that's because today's chemical industry is almost exclusively thermochemical, and there's a tremendous amount of know-how that is there in trying to take something and scale it to large scale. And it is volumetric in nature, so it should scale in terms of the economy of scale should be there. And with the know-how there, the question is, do we have the right pathway? And if you have cheap electricity, if you can do electrochemical, you should be able to do inductive heating, and the heating part should be relatively easy. So how do you do water splitting thermochemically? The most common approach is what is called a two-step reaction. It's essentially a redox heat engine. You take an oxide, you heat it, the oxygen comes out, now you got vacancies in there, expose it to water, and you reduce water to produce hydrogen, and then you turn this around, and you got heat addition at high temperature, heat rejection at low temperature. This is a heat engine. The work is a redox work. The challenge is the following, that the materials that are used today, and Will Chu did his thesis on this at Caltech, the materials are cerium oxide and ferrites, and the temperature, the high temperature part of it is 1500 degrees Celsius, and that, in terms of the industrial setting, it can be done, but it gets to be expensive. So the question is, can we reduce the temperature so that the material degradation actually goes down? And this has been a challenge. So how do you get to 1100 and preferably 1000 degrees, which is sort of the holy grail, and can we go even lower than 1000 degrees? Now this may seem easy, but it's not, because it's a thermodynamic problem. If the thermodynamic doesn't work, the kinetics don't matter. And if you look at the two reactions in the two-step, the delta G for both of them has to be less than 0. If you are in the red line, which is the high temperature one, anything below that line is thermodynamically feasible. And for the low temperature reaction, anything above the blue line is thermodynamically possible. Now, if you are operating at 1500 degrees Celsius, the high temperature, the region between the 1500, the dashed line, and the blue line is relatively large. You try to get to 1100 degrees Celsius, and that window shrinks. And so you've got a thermodynamic sweet spot which is really small. And the question is, can we get materials in there to be able for that to be able to do both the reactions simultaneously? And as you can see, cerium oxide kind of starts in there and immediately gets out of that region. But here at 1500, it's fine. Ferrites do the same. So the question is, how do you find a material that has the right enthalpy, but frankly has large entropy change, which is difficult to get? And we were looking for materials that would undergo phase transition, because in a phase transition you can get large entropy change. We ran into this material that was basically discovered 2 years ago called entropy stabilized oxides. And what you do is you take a bunch of oxides, magnesium oxide, cobalt, copper, etc., and you mix them together and heat it. And it is known that when you heat these oxides, you form essentially a stable structure. And in this case, it's stabilized by the entropy of mixing of the cations in a matrix of oxygen, matrix. And so this goes through a phase transition, and when you go from a spinel to a rock salt structure, the oxidation level changes of the cations, of the transition metal cations, and oxygen is kicked out. And so there you have now an interesting approach, and they've shown that this is indeed a phase transition, because if you change the number of cations, you can change the control of phase transition temperature. Now they discovered this material, but they didn't think about the water splitting part, and so we asked the question, can you use this phase transition for a water splitting reaction to produce hydrogen? And indeed we find a whole class of materials, not just one, whole class of materials that can split water by a phase transition from a spinel rock salt structure to a mostly rock salt structure, a little bit of spinel. And so when you go from a spinel to a rock salt, again the oxidation level of the various the transition metal changes. The question is, how good is it compared to cerium oxide and ferrites that are the high temperature materials? So here's some data. In the interest of time, I'll keep it short. This is at 1100 degrees Celsius, and you find that the gray bar out there for cerium oxide is the thermodynamic limit for cerium oxide. And you find also cobalt ferrites in two different ways of synthesizing this material. One is a sol gel technique, which seems to be working better. The other is solid state sintering method. And you have nickel ferrite and cobalt ferrite. That's the performance of the existing materials. And the material that we have found, this iron, magnesium, cobalt, nickel oxide, it's much better. This is 1100. And we said, can we try 1000 degrees where the other materials don't even work at all? And we find that indeed you can get this material to work to produce hydrogen at 1000 degrees Celsius. And we're trying to go even lower. The question is, of those cations that are there, iron, cobalt, and nickel, which one is actually redox active? Is one of them redox active, or all three of them redox active? The way to find out is to look at the X-ray absorption near its structure. So you hear this is where the oxidation level changes, shifts the core absorption of the electrons. And what we find, the bottom line is that we find iron to be the redox active species. Cobalt and nickel are redox inactive. What we're trying to find out is, what is cobalt and nickel doing in this lattice, and that we still are trying to figure this out. Since iron is the redox active, the question is there an optimal concentration of iron? And indeed we find the 30 to 35% of iron in this material seems to be working really well, and thus producing these amazing results. And cobalt really doesn't change much because it's not redox active. So this work has been funded by the DOE, Office of Fuel Cell Technology, a little bit of money from there, a little bit of money from SLAC, and a little bit from SunCap. So what are we trying to do next? We're trying to find the limits of kinetics and the thermodynamic capacity, and how can we approach these limits. We have done some measurement of kinetics. They actually look pretty good, but we don't know what the rate limiting steps are. And depending on the rate limiting steps, then you can tweak the kinetics. And the kinetics are then now very important in terms of the cost estimation, etc. We're trying to figure out the role of the polycation oxides. We think it is the entropy of mixing that reduces the phase transition temperature, but we're trying to find out more about this. And the question is, can we go down below 1000 degrees Celsius? Because that really reduces the material degradation and opens up all kinds of opportunities. The question is, can we reduce CO2 to CO? And if you can do that, then you potentially can syngas and other things. These are all reduction reactions, We're also exploring, which is a very difficult reaction, can you do partial oxidation with this material? Because now you can mix and match various cations, and you can statistically, you can think of copper and copper atoms around the oxygen and maybe a zinc atom elsewhere, and then you can do the oxidation from the material itself to see if you can partially oxidize methane to form methanol. This is, of course, a very, very difficult experiment. And because of this, we have, because of some of the results, we've got some funding now from the Office of Naval Research and Tomcat Center and another office from ERE through Idaho National Lab to try out all this variety of other things going on. Thank you very much.